Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be marking the 200th anniversary of CMJ, that is the Church's ministry amongst the Jews, presence in Israel. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is all the way from Australia. He is Kelvin Crombie, who's a historian and author. It's always a pleasure to see you, Kelvin, so welcome back to the Middle East Report, and thank you for what you've done for this programme over probably the last decade in giving us kind of historical analysis regarding Israel and the Jewish people. And the one I particularly remember is the book that you wrote about the battle for Alamay.
Well, great to be here again, Simon. Usually I try to time my visits for when the Australians are playing cricket over here. Ironically, they're playing at the Oval right now. We drove straight past it.
Oh, it's a shame.
You're more of a priority.
I appreciate that, especially coming from an Aussie as well, which is good. And of course, we've got the Ashes series this summer as well, so that'll be fantastic. But Kelvin, can you just give us a little bit of an update? You were here last year. You spoke very, very powerfully about how Messianic Jewish believers were also caught up and were murdered in the Holocaust, something that is not very widely known thanks to your groundbreaking research. So share with us what you've been up to in the past year and your association with CMJ, which is the Church's ministry amongst the Jewish people.
Well, the research on what happened to the Jewish Christians during the Holocaust continues. I do that under the umbrella of Heritage Resources, and we're in conjunction with CMJ and also with other people as well who are interested in the subject matter. So since I was with you last year, I spent time in Lithuania and Latvia going out and locating places of mass murder, burial sites, not pleasant places to track down, but nevertheless important if you're going to do the research. You have to look at the wider picture. And then after that, there was some time in Belgium when I had to go through 45,000 registration forms to work out who of those actually registered themselves as being associated with the church, and then from that be able to work out how many ultimately were murdered. And it was about 80 from the Jewish people that were in Belgium, for instance. So it's very time-consuming work to do that part, but also necessary. And just of late, I've spent time in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, in Serbia, and then in Far Eastern Romania, also locating places where things happened concerning the Holocaust. But also there were quite a few Jewish followers of Jesus, primarily in Hungary, but also in Eastern Romania at a place called Iași, where there actually was a whole community there. And they were basically almost destroyed, wiped out in a major pogrom at the end of June in 1941. So that's where I've just come from, actually, before coming here to the UK.
And you have your new book, there you go, let our viewers see this one, which is the 7 Phases of the Holocaust. Just share with us what new material that you've added to this book from the previous book that you wrote about how Messianic Jewish believers actually went through the Holocaust. I think you were looking at particularly France as a case in point.
Well, when you do research on a subject like this, trying to find evidence of the Jewish followers of Jesus who died in the Holocaust, you have to read the bigger picture. So that's why I endeavoured to go to all locations that are associated with the Holocaust, whether there were Jewish followers of Jesus there or not. There might have been, but that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm also trying to get the bigger picture. And as a result of doing huge amounts of research on site in all these different locations, and of course lots and lots of reading, I got to the point early on where I was getting a bit confused because there was so much material. And it was very difficult sometimes to work out, well, how does that fit in? What were the dates and what were the mechanisms involved in this decision being made? And very early on, I became aware of what's called the Madagascar Plan, which was a plan I spoke about last year, as you remember, to transport 4 million Jewish people to the island of Madagascar. Now, I cannot honestly say I knew much about that prior to doing this research. And And then I realised afterwards, when I spoke to Jewish people particularly, they also were not aware of it. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. So I saw the Madagascar plan as just one phase and realised that prior to that and after it were other phases as well. The Nazis didn't start off with a policy to murder 11 million Jewish people in Europe and surrounding areas. Okay, that was not the plan initially. It got to that plan, or to that stage, in what I call phases 6 and 7. And so I began to sort of realise, yes, there were different phases, and I personally have worked out there were 7 phases. There may be more. Okay, there may be less, depends. Lots of different researchers have their own models, and this is a model which tremendously helped me. So when I could see that there was this phase, when I came across information, I could fit it into that particular parameter, and I said, that makes sense. Now, not neat parameters like that. There was a lot of overlap, but nevertheless, I could still see there were 7 fairly distinct periods of time in which the Nazis went from one policy to another. One policy wasn't working, so they went to another policy, until finally it came to what we call the final solution to the Jewish problem, inverted commas, which was the murder of 11 million Jewish people in Europe and surrounding areas. So what I found myself doing was trying to take all this information and making it understandable to myself. And then when I began to explain that to some other people, they said, well, we can actually understand that. So I thought, right, I'll write it down for myself firstly, but also it might be beneficial to others. So it's in a sense, it's an abridged version of how the Holocaust came about. It doesn't have all the information there, it doesn't intend to, because most books on the Holocaust are very dense, very big, very full, lots of information, and it, messes you up a little bit afterwards. So I've tried to make it as, not simple, but as concise as I possibly can, so a person who doesn't know much can pick it up and have a better idea afterwards of these different phases, which led from A right the way through to...
Amazing. So there we go. Definitely worth a read if you're interested in knowing what happened, particularly to the plight of Messianic Jewish believers. Then this is a read that's definitely worth it. And also you're here as well on a tour. We've got Jane with us in the studios as well. She's a bit camera shy. And where we'll be celebrating the 200th anniversary of the ministry that is CMJ in Jerusalem, in particular in Israel. So share with us how significant this 200th anniversary is for the ministry of CMJ.
Well, on this particular tour, it's doing various engagements, speaking some places on covenant, some places on the Jewish followers of Jesus in the Holocaust. And the idea is also to do a bit of preparation work for a major tour we're having in the end of August, which will be in Ireland, and then from all the way through September, starting in Scotland, going down through, right the way down through England and hopefully Wales as well. Something like 20 engagements just in the September period of time. Looking at a subject matter which I think is quite important, because this year is 75 years since the State of Israel was established. So many people are aware of that, 75 years. So lots of people went to Israel because of this. But not too many people are aware that the 75 years was actually built upon another foundation, which happened 200 years ago. And so in 1823, CMJ made the official decision to establish a base in Jerusalem. And already a lot of people might be thinking, well, what's the connection? Well, the connection is quite significant because they were your standard bearers, those pioneer CMJ workers that went out to the land of Israel. They carried a vision with them. Now, there weren't many people that went out initially. A number of them died, and it took them a lot of time and effort to finally get established there. It was only 1833 that they finally, as an entity, could be established. So it took them 10 years, you might say, of going in, and they'd made the decision and getting knocked back, and they went back again. But the importance is not in how few people went out there, it's the vision that they carried. And that is the important thing, I think, which is not relevant to just an organisation called CMJ, Church's Ministry Among Jewish People. It actually represents, I believe, the heart of evangelical Christianity in Britain and elsewhere, because they were representing all those entities and people, and God in his great mercy chose a small little group in London, basically, in the East End of London. And he said, right, you are going to be the conduit. And it started off, as you know, initially from the vision of a Messianic, well, we call him today a Messianic Jewish believer called Joseph Frey, okay, a Hebrew Christian from Germany. Okay, so a Jewish man from Germany who was a nonconformist. He was the one who came in with the original vision. But the London Missionary Society, which was a nonconformist entity, they were the ones who actually gave him the platform initially, and then later Anglicans got involved, and then in 1809 CMJ was birthed as not an Anglican society initially, it was a non-denominational organisation, but people like William Wilberforce became involved, as well as many others as well. And so it had both Anglicans and non-Anglicans involved, and in 1815 it became an evangelical Anglican society. And so it grew a little bit, yes, when you have people like Wilberforce being involved, of course there's going to be a lot of exposure. But the fact of the matter is, from that very, very small foundation, things began to develop, the vision began to grow, and ultimately they said, right, especially after the Napoleonic Wars, we have to take this burden, the burden that God has given us to introduce Jewish people to Jesus as Messiah, we have to take this vision back to where it came from, back to Jerusalem itself. So even though attempts were made in 1820, in 1821 and 22, the decision was finally only made in 1823, right, we're going to establish a base in Jerusalem. So there was a vision that you might say was birthed initially in Jerusalem. We went around the world, came to London, and people said, right, we've got to take it back to its home basically. So that's what they did. And it's a vision that was broad, very broad. First and foremost, and this is very, very important people understand this, the desire of God was to introduce Jewish people to Jesus as Messiah, that he is the one that took the death penalty for all humankind, to the Jew first and also to the non-Jew. And that was the message God wanted to be taken back to Jerusalem. That was the essence of why he raised up CMJ in the first point. But later, other aspects also became involved. What about the Jewish followers of Jesus, okay? They were cast out of their own community. They felt, well, where do we belong? A lot of the Christian churches and Christian people couldn't quite understand them and didn't accept them. So a little group called the B'nai Avraham, the sons of Abraham, was birthed in 1813. Basically in order to allow these Jewish followers of Jesus to feel home with each other. So you might say that is actually the birth of the modern Messianic Jewish movement. And it came under the covering, you might say, of CMJ, Joseph Frey. Separate in one sense, but still under the same covering. And then they began to go out to the churches. And a lot of people in the churches didn't know much about the Jewish people, didn't know much about what the scriptures were saying. And so the idea was then to begin to teach them, well, what do the scriptures say about Jesus being Jewish? And the importance of the restoration of Israel, and so on and so forth. And of course then, within the mix, and it wasn't huge at the beginning in one sense, but within the mix there was also this idea that ultimately the Jewish people will return to the land of Israel in great numbers. And so that's all part of the overall mix. But the first and most important aspect was we want to introduce the Jewish people to our best friend who is Jesus the Messiah. That's the vision that they took out in 1823.
So can you share a little bit more about who Joseph Frey was? You mentioned the fact that he was Jewish, you mentioned the fact that he was a German, and how did he end up being in London? Because I just did a little bit of research before the programme, and he was very influenced by the plight of the Jewish people living in East London and their plight, because that was one of the first port of calls that the Jewish people made when they tried to make a new home for themselves in this country.
Well, I think the story of Joseph Levi, as he was known as initially, and Joseph Frey, is a great story in a sense, because he was a bit like David, I suppose, and like the rest of us, not perfect, right? Made a few mistakes along the way, okay? And so too with Joseph Frey. He wasn't the perfect person, yet he was still the one that God raised up over there in Germany in about 1796 or thereabouts. He actually was on a carriage going between one city and another city, and in the carriage was another Jewish person. We'd call him today a secular Jewish person. And there was also an evangelical Christian. It could have been a Pietist, it could have been a Moravian. And somewhere along the journey, the Christian introduced Joseph Levi to Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 to 34, and the promise of the new covenant. Now, Joseph Levi, like many Jewish people around the globe today, have never heard of the promise of a new covenant, okay, in Jeremiah. And so it was recited to him, and he thought, what's this, you know? So anyhow, he got convicted then and there of the truth of this particular prophecy, that God was going to introduce a new covenant. There will be forgiveness of sins, and there will be relationship, because God says that you shall know me from the least of them to the greatest of them. And that really just got him. He didn't confess faith straight away. It took him a little while, like many of us, okay? We get the epiphany, but sometimes we battle against it. And it finally happened. He got baptized, and his name was changed to Joseph Frey, and he went to a Bible college in Berlin. And in 1801, that Bible college was asked to send some missionaries to Britain to work for the London Missionary Society. Now, it just so happened in those days, the Brits sort of had a lot of the initiative. They might have had the capital to establish missionary societies, but you didn't have that many local-born workers. And so a lot of the local-born workers came from Europe, okay, supplied by the Berlin Seminary and also the Basel Seminary. And so Joseph Frey was one of those. So he came over. Now, he wasn't supposed to come and stay in London. He was supposed to go down to South Africa and work with the Reverend van der Kemp amongst the Hottentots, or a group down there. But his boat was delayed. Okay, so if anybody wants to go somewhere and your boat is delayed, just say, well, perhaps God's got a reason for this. Because when the boat was delayed, he spent more time here in London, and he went to a couple of German congregations that were here. But he also noticed the plight of the Jewish people, the destitute Jewish people in London. And he began to think, what am I going to down there for, to learn a new language and a new culture? I can stay here and introduce Jesus to my own people. I know their way of thinking, I know their culture, I know their language, I know the Tanakh, the scriptures, the prophecies, voila. And so he made the suggestion to the London Missionary Society, and of course, like most committees, they probably hummed and ahed and all that sort of stuff, but they said yes. So he stayed, and he went, did some extra training with a guy called Reverend David Bogue down at Southport, a very well-known Congregationalist. And 1805 he was released. But what he found after a while is that the methodologies that he was expected to use were the same as they would be, and the literature, the same as they would use for ministry to pagan peoples. People had no idea at all about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he realised that you don't need to use, or you can't use the same approach in a sense to Jewish people. So he wanted to actually have a little bit of extra kudos, you might say. And they weren't that willing to give it to him. So perhaps he's a bit headstrong. Okay, plus the fact that the committee probably was a little bit stubborn. They didn't want to go give him a German Jewish bloke, what he wanted. And so as a result of that, other people began to come in and get behind him. And I won't go through all the hullabaloo about it, but in 1809, a separate ministry was birthed, okay, of Anglicans, non-Anglicans primarily, and Anglicans. That was called the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews. And usually by the time I finished saying that, I forgot how it began. It's so long. So they shortened it to the London Jew Society. Today it's called CMJ. So Joseph Frey, a very, very unlikely character, a German-born Jewish follower of Jesus who came to England. I'm not sure how good his English was, even after a few years, but he was the one that God chose. A nonconformist, you might say. But when it became an Anglican society in 1815, there were some problems. Frey himself went through some personal issues, plus the issues that the fact he wasn't ordained, and so ultimately in 1816 they parted ways, and so he went ultimately to the United States. And CMJ then continued on as it did, and it's very interesting as I've come to see things, if it wasn't associated with the Anglican Church and the establishment, I don't think they would have been able to establish their presence in the land of Israel. I don't think they would have been able to establish Christchurch, for instance, in Jerusalem.
Share with us that story, because that's quite incredible. Because if we take historically at that time, Israel, Jerusalem was under occupation by the Ottoman Empire that certainly reigned for 400 years, almost exactly, over the whole entire Middle East. How did they think that they would then influence the sultans in Istanbul to say, can we set up the first evangelical Church of England church in the Middle East, but also in Jerusalem in particular?
Well, listen, when you look at things at one particular level, you think these guys are really off the wall. If they really thought they could actually go and establish their presence as a Protestant organisation in Jerusalem of all places, they really were, off their rocker, you might say. Obviously, there was a lot of faith. There must have been a lot of faith with those people. They must have believed so strongly and firmly that God had given them this vision, and that one day a great number of Jewish people would come back to the land. So they persevered. And as I said, it took them 10 years before, from the time they made the decision until finally 1833. But that only happened because of geopolitics. Now, I believe that geopolitics are affected by people praying, okay? Look at Daniel, for instance, as a bit of an example. When Daniel prayed and reminded God of his promise, then what happened shortly afterwards, okay, the king of Persia allowed the Jewish people to go back. And I think there are some geopolitical factors involved in that, of course, but we won't go into that right now. So when we come to the 1830s, until that point, yes, Turkey held control. It was an Islamic country. And the Caliph, the Sultan was also the Caliph of Islam, etc., etc. No new churches were allowed to be built in the region under the control of Islam. No new sect, okay, or group could be established there. So the Protestants couldn't be established. There was a status quo. It was called the millet system. So everything was against the permanent presence of an evangelical Christian Protestant group there. Yet they persevered. Geopolitics then intervened because the Egyptians rose up in revolt against Turkey and kicked them out of the land of Israel. And of course the Egyptians wanted to make sure they were on the right side of Britain.
And that was Muhammad Ali, wasn't it?
Mehmed Ali, bango, okay? And so right at that very juncture, geopolitics getting involved in the whole battle for the empires. You see, you have to understand this context of the battle of the empires and the land of Israel being smack bang in the middle, not just the three continents, but all these ancient trade routes. Is God sovereign over geography or what, you know?
Absolutely.
Okay, or just continental drift. So that's what basically happened. So the Egyptians wanted to make sure they got on the right side of Britain. Well, which British people were around at that time who wanted to go and live in Jerusalem? Nobody except for CMJ. There was also a small American group, okay? I have to acknowledge them. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. They were also there at the same time as CMJ, but ultimately they left and went to Beirut. It was only CMJ that remained in Jerusalem. So because of geopolitics and because of CMJ was ready to come in, that's why in October 1833, John Nicolason, Hans Nicolason, who was actually Danish, okay? He wasn't one of your mob, he was actually Danish. Nevertheless, okay, he was working for CMJ. And so that's how CMJ was established there in the first instance. But nevertheless, that's a long way from getting permission to own property and also from actually getting permission to build a church. So that's another 2-hour lecture in itself. But
Absolutely.
In a nutshell, that did happen. They got the property and they got an Armenian person to be involved in that. And it's not just a property. In 1838, they managed to purchase property, not just anywhere in the old city. It was, in my opinion, the most strategic piece of land anywhere in the old city because it's on, you might say, the upper city, okay, where Herod's palace had once been. So it was on the palace grounds of Herod, right next door to the ancient citadel, next to Jaffa Gate. Perfect location. Jewish quarter there, Armenian quarter there, Christian quarter there. Voila. I mean, you got any
Absolutely.
better.
And David's Tower as well.
David's Tower, that was the interesting thing about it, because if you look at David's Tower, okay, that's part of the complex that was left standing by the Romans in 70 AD. And Josephus said they left it there to be a monument, to be a testimony of Roman might. Okay, so Roman might meant Jewish defeat. Jewish defeat meant exile. So for me, it's a representative building for the period of exile. Not just the exile from the land, but don't forget that after 135 AD, all Jewish people were forbidden from living in the land of Israel, which they renamed Assyria Palestina. That included the Jewish Christians, the Jewish followers of Jesus. So no more lived there. Okay? The church until that point was led by the Jewish people. So it was also an exile from a spiritual context as well. So I look upon it as a monument of exile. What happens in 1838, all those years later? Evangelicals from this country, representing the broader perspective, came in with a vision to restore the message of Jesus to the Jewish people, and that God would restore the people to the land. And where did God put them? Look at the cover of the book and you'll see it's immediately opposite the citadel. And there's the old British flag there, as you see,
there we go.
Hanging over Christchurch.
So we've got this book here, which is From Exile to Restoration. And yeah, the British flag.
And so that's the next stage, and then getting permission to build a church, well, that's another story in itself.
And so, Kelvin, also tell us about the first Protestant bishop, Michael Solomon Alexander, and how he ended up in Jerusalem. And according to your website, he was the first Jewish bishop in the Holy Land since the Bar Kokhba revolt back in AD 32.
Yes, also the story of Michael Solomon Alexander is the German connection again. He came from a little village called Szumlanka, now it's called Czeczenka in Poland, and it was part of Posen, which is a region of East Prussia, you might say, that sort of region over there. It's now part of Poland. Son of a rabbi, and his older brother was going to be the rabbi. So he came over to England as a young fella, went into Essex. He was in Norwich and Colchester. He heard the message of Jesus from different people over there, and he thought, no, I've got to get away from this mob. So he went down to Plymouth, you know, sort of going from one end to the other. We'll get away from this Jesus stuff. Well, he gets down there, and of course, he again hears about Jesus as the Messiah. And it's a long story, but he came to faith ultimately in 1825, if I'm not mistaken, and came to faith in Jesus as Messiah. And he was actually involved in the synagogue there, and he got baptized in St Andrew's Church, which is just around the corner. So you can just imagine, and that would have actually been quite an issue back then. Then from there he went to Ireland, and he worked with the Irish Jew Society, which was the equivalent of the London Jew Society in Ireland. They'd been established, I think, in 1810, the Dublin Jew Society, and they were basically synonymous. And got involved there, and ultimately he came to work with the London Society for promoting Christianity amongst the Jews, and he went to work over in Germany again. 1830s he came back and worked in a place called Palestine Place, which was CMJ Centre in the East End at that stage. Interesting name, isn't it? Palestine Place, when you consider that this was a ministry to Jewish people and you look at the derivation of the name Palestine. But anyhow, that's another story. 5 acres of property in the East End was the centre of CMJ's work then. So he was working there alongside others in all forms of ministry. Then in 1840, the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, had what he called his midnight summer's dream. And he dreamed of a Protestant union with Jerusalem as the centre. And he had a close associate called Chevalier Bunsen, who actually was an Anglophile, you might say. I think his wife was British. He knew Shaftesbury. So in 1841, the King of Prussia sent him over with a few proposals. He was to meet with Shaftesbury and other government ministers. They were trying to form an alliance between Prussia and Britain, you might say. And one of the proposals was for the establishment of a Protestant bishopric in Jerusalem between the Germans and the Anglicans, the British. Now, who had ever heard of such a thing? So it caused a bit of a furore amongst some of the Germans, but of course a huge furore over here with a lot of your Anglo-Catholics and people who just didn't like this idea of being joined together with something with those Protestant heretics over there on the continent. Okay, but for most of the evangelicals, this was a great thing. So he met with Shaftesbury, and then with Palmerston, and then with the Queen. And Parliament passed, they accepted the idea, that passed. It was basically called the Jerusalem Protestant Bishopric Act. And that went into being at the end of 1841. And then CMJ was asked to nominate the first bishop. And the first person to actually be asked was an Irishman called Alexander McCall. And he knew Michael Solomon Alexander quite well. They worked together. And he said, no, it has to be a Hebrew of the Hebrews. And so Michael Solomon Alexander was asked, and he accepted. And on the 21st of January 1842, he actually arrived in Jerusalem as the first Protestant bishop, the first Anglican bishop, and the first leader of the church in Jerusalem, who was Jewish, since 135 AD, when the Roman edict went forth that no more Jewish people could live in Jerusalem.
Amazing. Also, there were schools and hospitals built in Jerusalem that time, was it? Can you just share with us the kind of vision, not only to have an evangelical outpost in Jerusalem amongst the surrounded by the Ottoman Empire, but also then to build schools and hospitals? Share with us why that was so strategically important.
Well, you've got to have a picture of what Jerusalem was like in that period of time. It's not like it is today, a modern bustling city. Then it was really a stink pot. They just read anything which Mark Twain wrote 40 or 50 years after CMJ went there. Just imagine what it was like when those early pioneer missionaries went to Jerusalem. It really was a stink pot. The tannery was in the middle of town, okay, and the slaughterhouse was in the middle of the old city. So disease was rife. And it really wasn't a pleasant place to live. And so early on, one of the Irish missionaries that went there, his name was Reverend William Lewis. He was actually the pioneer in 1823. He wrote some messages back and said, we need a British consul here, but also there needs to be something, Jerusalem needs something that we, that rather than just us going there as missionaries, we need to provide something that it needs. So what do they need above anything else really was a good hospital and a doctor. So that's why the second person to go out on a permanent basis was another Irishman, Dr. George Dalton. And he went out there and he didn't live very long, but he went out there to establish a medical work. And so straight away, CMJ realised, okay, right, that's what we actually need to do. So when Bishop Alexander went out in 1842, he took a man called Dr. Edward McGowan with him. And his purpose was to establish a hospital. And so he started up a medical work, and as a result of that medical work to Jewish people, it caused a reaction within the Jewish community. Many Jewish people would come, and they valued it, but the Jewish leadership now had a problem. Their people are going to the mission, to the missionaries, okay? They had no capacity to do anything, so Moses Montefiore sent out a Jewish doctor, Dr. Frankel at that time. And then later the Rothschild family from France, they also got involved and sent out a man called Dr. Albert Cohen, who later established a bona fide Jewish hospital as well. So CMJ were the pioneers in doing medical work, and it made a huge impact because not only were they helping Jewish people and others as well, okay, but it caused a reaction. It caused the other communities to step up and begin to do something. So the development of Jerusalem across the board has much to do with the pioneer work of CMJ. And also with the bishopric, German entities began to come in as well, and they too played a huge role. And Britain, of course, I forgot to mention this, in 1838, the British established a consulate in Jerusalem, the first, and that's how ultimately Christ Church was built. It was built as the private chapel of the British consul. But the initial instructions given to the British consul, William Tanner Young, were these: to grant protection to the Jews generally. In other words, because of the influence of Shaftesbury and because of the influence of many evangelicals, including those within CMJ, but also the Scottish mission as well, and nonconformists, they had a big influence upon British policy at that time. And so amongst the initial instructions given to the consul were to protect the Jewish people. And so they did that. So that was, in a sense, a foundation for why the British consulate was established. Yeah, they were there to keep geopolitical eyes on the French and the Russians, but also to protect the Jewish people. And of course, to protect the one or two Protestant Christians who were living there as well. I mean, one or two Protestant British Christians, they need a consul, yeah? Stands to reason. Yes, okay. But so there were other bigger factors. But what happened then was that ultimately every major European power, plus the United States, also sent consuls to Jerusalem. And so the importance of Jerusalem began to grow politically, geopolitically, after Britain established the consulate. So I've been asked questions in the past about, when did the restoration of Israel begin, etc. I'll often go back to either 1823 or 1838, when Britain established the consulate, because you can see it was for geopolitical purposes, and you see the reactions from it. And Jerusalem ceased thereafter being a little tiny provincial town in the Turkish Empire. It began to be a microcosm of the macrocosm.
Amazing. So if we fast forward a few decades into the next century, which would have been with the start of the First World War, occurred in August of 1914, how did that change everything? Because we know that the Ottoman Empire decided to align themselves with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire against the British and the French and the Russians, and therefore the Ottoman Empire was then at war with Britain. What was the plight of those who were based in Jerusalem during that time, and also how did the Ottomans then view the Jewish community living in the Ottoman province of Palestine?
There's lots of levels here.
Yeah.
First of all, you had a lot of Jewish people who had come from Europe, come from Russia, and some come from Germany and Austria. That was no problem. But for all those that came from Russia, if they didn't have Ottoman citizenship, there was going to be a huge problem because they were seen as sort of the enemy. So a lot of them were kicked out.
They were the first Jewish people to make Aliyah to Israel, didn't they? Russia and the...
Well, there were Jewish people living in Israel all the way along, okay? Just the first major immigration was 1882, what we call the first Aliyah. And so a lot of these people had not taken Ottoman citizenship. So by 1914, they were viewed as sort of potential fifth colonists. And so at least 10,000 were initially just rounded up, anybody who didn't have citizenship, and just put on the boats and sent down to Egypt. And it wasn't an easy time for them. And so for the Jewish community that was there was David Ben-Gurion was there, for instance, the later Prime Minister. Those people sort of thought, well, what do we do here? Do we actually become Ottoman citizens and join the army or not? Well, as a Jewish person, being in the Ottoman army at that time wasn't a very good option, okay? So some of them left, okay? Others decided they wanted to become Ottoman citizens and stay. But as the war went on, it became progressively more difficult for the Jewish people living in the land of Israel. If I'm not mistaken, I won't say the death toll throughout the war, but a lot of them died of deprivation. But a lot of other people too died of deprivation during the war. And so there was that particular aspect. As far as CMJ was concerned, of course, nobody who had a British connection could stay. So there was a couple of people who looked after the CMJ properties. They had German connections, James Hanauer, for instance. His parents originally come from Germany. So they stayed and they looked after the CMJ work in the land of Israel. But most of our properties were taken over by the Turks and used for different things. We had the big hospital, which is now the Anglican school, that was taken over by the Turks. Parts of Christchurch were taken over. The hospital that CMJ ran, the big hospital in Sfat in the north, was taken over, and so on and so forth. But that happened to many organisations that came from so-called belligerent countries. So that all happened. Now, on the other side, the geopolitical side, the fact that the Turks joined with the Germans, actually meant there was now an opportunity for that desire of many to see the Jewish people come back to the land of Israel to be formalised, you might say. Because while Turkey remained an ally of Britain, or at least not a belligerent of Britain, well, Britain wasn't going to militarily conquer it. Okay, but once they joined the war, then the battle began, and it began in Gallipoli and in Mesopotamia, basically conjointly. We were defeated in Gallipoli, came back to Egypt, and then of course the idea was to protect the Suez Canal, and so in 1916 we actually went over, we being the British and the Australians and the New Zealanders. We've got to make sure we get the Anzacs in there.
Of course, absolutely.
And they took the entire Sinai to create a big buffer zone. Now at the end of that year, basically, they'd done what they're supposed to do. And then I would say this was the providence of God, because then there was a change of government. And that's when David Lloyd George became Prime Minister, and he brought in Arthur Balfour to be his Foreign Secretary. And Lloyd George didn't want a situation whereby after the war, the French would have control over the land of Israel, or the Russians would have control over the land of Israel, or anybody else. He wanted control over that entire region, the east side of the Suez Canal, okay, because Britain already controlled the other side, because he wanted to be in a position where he knew the Suez Canal was secure, okay, and therefore the Eastern Empire was secure. And so he therefore sanctioned the capture of the land of Israel. Okay, at the end of 1916 into 1917, it actually began, and so the conquest was first of all in Gaza. We were defeated there, and then of course it was Beersheba, the big victory there on the 31st of October 1917, in which the British were involved, the Kiwis were involved, and of course the Australians finished it off with that magnificent charge at the end of the day. But I like to say it was a team effort that got us there, and on that very, very same day, the cabinet back here made that decision, which we later called the Balfour Declaration. But it was a minute that was in the War Cabinet, or the War Committee meeting of that time. And that without the victory at Beersheba, that would have been just a worthless piece of paper. People go on and on about the Balfour Declaration. That's okay, but don't forget, the Balfour Declaration was just a decision made by a cabinet here. The land of Israel had to be captured from the Turks before that could be implemented. So that began the whole process thereafter. And 5 weeks later, after Beersheba, of course, there was the capture of Jerusalem. And this is where things began to come together wonderfully. I mean, I get a bit carried away here. I hope you don't mind that. But at that particular time, when Jerusalem was captured on the 9th of December, because it was mostly by the British infantry, there were some British mounted troops, and also the Western Australian 10th Light Horse was involved there as well. I've got to bring that one out. And then on the 11th of December was the official surrender ceremony. And that's when General Allenby came. He rode down to Jaffa Gate, okay, he got off his horse, and he didn't get off his horse because of anything mystical. He got off his horse because he was told to. His government told him to get off because nothing could happen on that day which would antagonise all the Muslims that were in the British Empire, okay, and that could antagonise other allies who were Catholic, for instance. So it had to be a very, very nondescript sort of a victory ceremony, if you understand what I mean.
Absolutely.
He walked in, okay, and he came in and he stood on the steps leading into the citadel. What's the citadel represent? For me, exile, right? Jewish defeat way back there in 135, okay? He stood on the steps of that particular building. Didn't go in, he just stood on the steps, facing Christchurch. What does Christchurch represent? Restoration. It represents all those who had a vision and a heart for restoring the message of Jesus back to the Jewish people in Jerusalem, for the Jewish people to come back to the land. It's a symbol of restoration. And there's Allenby facing that particular building. He didn't go in, okay? A couple of Israeli historians try to tell me he did go in, so I spent weeks looking through all sorts of materials over here in your archives, and unfortunately I could not find any evidence. I wish I had, but I couldn't. But on that particular occasion, when he was facing, there was a guard of honour over there, right in front of Christchurch, and that guard of honour comprised of 110 soldiers from right throughout Britain, okay, some other entities, but also there was over 60 Australian and New Zealand soldiers, and those Australian soldiers were from Western Australia, the 10th Light Horse, where I came from. So that sort of added something personal to the whole thing, which I didn't know about when I was growing up in WA and started doing my research. It's just something that just came. And so for me, it was an incredible moment in history. It brought together so many different things. And from that point onwards, of course, well, you get to the Balfour Declaration, going into the British Mandate, and then further going on into the situation which happened in the 1920s and 30s with the rise of Nazism, the Second World War, and then we get up to 1948.
Yeah. But while we're discussing the Second World War, I think a very important part and the chapter of CMJ's history, isn't it, is the fact that according to my notes here, let me just get them here. That in the 1930s, the Ministry of CMJ had extensive work. They had built churches, schools, hospitals throughout throughout Eastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. How were these affected with the advance of Nazi forces into Eastern Europe and also North Africa as well?
Well, first thing that needs to be said that prior to 1914, CMJ, I think they had about 46 bases, if I'm not mistaken. They had over 200 full-time personnel working in hospitals and entities all spread throughout the world. The First World War knocked a lot of those out for monetary reasons, for other reasons as well. So they were cut back quite a bit. So they consolidated where they could. In Bucharest, for instance, in Romania, they had a magnificent work there. In Warsaw, they had an incredible work. In Jerusalem and Cairo, and other parts of North Africa, even in Persia, okay? Lots of different places they had fairly substantial entities and works going on. And then with the Second World War, of course, then a lot of those works, ceased to exist. In Warsaw, for instance, it completely ceased to exist. The building that CMJ had then was bombed in the early days, and they had I think about a 4-story building there in the centre of Warsaw, and that was bombed out. They had a fairly thriving Hebrew-speaking congregation, or Hebrew Christian congregation, sorry. It was Polish and English being spoken there. And ultimately, there was well over 100 people, well over 100 Jewish people in that congregation, and only a handful survived the Holocaust. In Bucharest, they lost people there, but not as many as elsewhere. And in North Africa, of course, they have some problems in different parts of North Africa that came under German control at different periods of time. The work in Jerusalem continued to, I wouldn't say thrive, but it did continue. The hospital for a time was also made available to the British forces as well. And so it was a very, very challenging time for Jewish people and Jewish followers of Jesus everywhere that was under either Italian or particularly German control. And then, of course, in the war itself, during the war itself, as we know that as the Germans began to come down through Yugoslavia and into Greece in 1941, and it became known what they began to do to the Jewish people there, then it was certain that whichever country they took over, which area they took over, it was going to be very, very difficult for Jewish people. And so when the Germans then came in to help the Italians in North Africa and began to move across towards Egypt, then you could imagine if you were any one of the 700,000 or so Jewish people who lived in Egypt, the land of Israel, Syria and Iraq, if you lived in that area there, you'd be very, very nervous at this stage because, you know, after Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans came into the Soviet Union, their goal was also to come down from the north as well. So it was like a pincer movement. So you had the military things going on, but you've also got the concerns there for the Jewish people. So every time there was an Allied defeat, of course, that was very difficult for the Jewish people. Many of them wanted to join up. Some could join up with the British, but the British wouldn't allow so many Jewish volunteers, especially into infantry forces, because they were afraid that after the war was over, they could be fighting against the same people. But those that could join up in auxiliary units, they did so. But nevertheless, for the average person, it was a very, very difficult plight. But every time there was an Allied victory, particularly when we held out at Tobruk in 1941, and it was mostly an Australian garrison that was there at Tobruk, everybody was excited. And then, of course, later in 1942, as Rommel began to come across the North African desert, there was tremendous apprehension amongst the Jewish people in the region. And then when there was victory at El Alamein, there was ecstasy in the land of Israel and in Egypt and wherever Jewish people lived.
And I remember the program that we recorded 10 years ago, and you showed me the actual Bible that was actually given to the British commander at the time.
Montgomery, yes.
Montgomery, which was a very special Bible. And also you discussed in that program, I remember that I didn't know before, is that the SS stood by ready to round up the Jews of North Africa and also the Jews of the British Mandate of Palestine had the Germans gone into Egypt, and then would have gone into British Mandate of Palestine as well. So moving across then from the Second World War to the turmoil in the Middle East during the kind of early 1940s with the British Mandate, we see then that the British Mandate expired on the 14th of May 1948, and this is where we see that David Ben-Gurion made that courageous decision to declare independence. So share with us what happened when Jerusalem, certainly West Jerusalem fell under Israeli sovereignty during Israel's War of Independence.
Well, in that period of time, it was a bit of a debate amongst the various mission societies and also amongst many of the Hebrew Christians themselves. What would life be like for them after the State of Israel was established? Would they be accepted or would they be persecuted? So one of the contentious issues in that period of time was that many of the mission societies took a lot of the Hebrew Christians that were involved with them out of the country. It's called Operation Mercy. And some stayed behind, but many came out. And so there are some people in the Messianic movement today that sort of thought that shouldn't have happened. But it did happen, okay? And the people who were involved in making that decision had their reasons. So after the State of Israel was established, those that remained, of course, were now part of a new context. They were no longer part of British Mandate Palestine, they were now part of the Jewish State of Israel. Some survivors, some Jewish Christians, Messianic Jews, as we now call them, who survived the Holocaust, then came, okay, and joined with those that were there. And so the foundations began to be laid for, you might say, almost a new movement, okay? It's a new but an old. Okay, the foundation's already been laid from the past, but now they were Israelis. It was part of an Israeli movement. But it wasn't until possibly the late 1980s, and Bet Emmanuel, which is one of the centres of CMJ, actually played a part in this, when a number of the Jewish followers of Jesus began to come together, and they began to put music and songs together which were Israeli rather than the old hymns being translated. They began to sort of put a bit more of an Israeli flavour and context. And so in many ways you can probably say from the mid-1980s the modern Israeli Messianic movement sort of began to really take on, and it's grown ever since then. And And there are so many congregations that are in the land of Israel now, and so many, well over 10,000 Jewish followers of Jesus. Some make a greater number. And at Christchurch in the Old City, there was a Hebrew-speaking congregation that's been operating there since 1987 under the leadership of Benjamin Reuben Berger primarily. And a little bit different, of course, to the one that Bishop Alexander was a part of, but nevertheless, they are still carrying forth, in a sense, the same vision, the vision of restoration. Amen. And so I look upon that congregation and the one at Bet Emmanuel, and there's also still one up at the Anglican school as well, and all the others, in a sense, they are, you might say, taking the vision on and expanding it from that original vision that went out there in the early 1800s. So it's like foundations, okay, and the growth that's come from it today. And we should all be rejoicing in what's happening today, because we know that today more and more Israeli Jewish people, as well as Arabic-speaking people, are being introduced to Jesus as the Messiah. He is the one who came and took the death penalty for all of humankind upon himself and rose again from the dead. Offers everybody, to the Jew first and also to non-Jew, the opportunity of entering into covenant union with Jesus and being in a relationship once again with God Almighty.
Amazing, Kelvin. That was very special presentation. Very much appreciate that, and I know that our viewers will as well. So we've got 6 minutes left of the programme, and there were so many areas of history that we haven't really even touched on. The liberation of Jerusalem in 67 with the Six-Day War, that would have meant that the CMJ would then be back under Israeli territory rather than Jordanian territory. And then, of course, the other major events that we're seeing in Israel and the Middle East since. But what would you say the legacy of CMJ is after the decision to, and the vision, I would say, rather than the decision, to actually set up a headquarters in Jerusalem 200 years on?
Well, I think the legacy is that they were people of vision, and they carried with them this messianic vision, this prophetic vision in many, many ways. Yeah, you might have had a Wilberforce and a Shaftesbury sort of, being involved, but basically, when you look at it, they were ordinary people. And God used ordinary people to bring about his purposes. And they were ordinary people who actually, in a sense, you might say, saw the signs of the times, and they went in. And they're ordinary people that persevered despite the obstacles that were put against them. And I think that's a very, very important principle. They were obedient, okay, to a call, and they overcame the obstacles. And they overcame the obstacles because they were persistent, and also because, obviously, a lot of prayer. So they laid a foundation. Now, I don't think they fully comprehended that all these years later, the vision would have developed as it did. I don't know if they would have actually seen a modern Israeli secular sort of society, but nevertheless, that's what it is. And so you've got foundations and you've got what's up there today. And I think it's important for the entity that's there today to have an understanding of the roots, an understanding of how it all began. There's no compulsion for the Israeli Messianic movement today to become Anglicans, okay, and to take on all the different garb and ways of worship that the people back then had. There's no need for that. Okay? They've got their own way of worshipping God. But I still think it's good to be able to be aware of, to be made aware of the vision carriers and the tremendous boldness that they had. Boldness not just in the physical, but also in the spiritual, to do what they had. And I think that can actually be a testimony for today. And
having a legacy of over 200 years is absolutely extraordinary. So you've got a speaking engagements coming up over the summer. So 18 venues across the UK and Ireland. So just unpack for us how our viewers across the country, including those in Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, can actually come and see you in action and come and hear your kind of fabulous historical lectures, Kelvin.
Well, as far as I'm aware at this stage, the last week of August will be in Ireland. The itinerary hasn't quite been formulated yet, so people can contact CMJ Ireland. And in the UK, we're starting off at the beginning of September up in Inverness, and then having some other appointments in Scotland. And then from the 10th, it's basically below, what do you call it, the border? You've got a border these days?
Well, we have. I think the Scots probably say, yes, we definitely got a border.
Well, then it's back into England and Ireland. And then I think there's 18 or so engagements down here in Wales as well. And that finishes up, we are planning to have a finale basically down here in London, right at the end of September. And the idea behind this is to go to a whole different lot of locations and find locations where somebody who had actually a part of the storyline came from and introduce that individual. Like for instance in Hull, if we get a venue near Hull, it will be Wilberforce, okay? Wimborne, it will be Shaftesbury. And somewhere else, it would be Lewis Way or Charles Simeon when we go to Cambridge, okay? And so there were lots of other different, very, very colourful people who came from different parts of the UK. So we actually want to introduce them as well. And we might actually have some very interesting ways of introducing these historical characters.
That's amazing, amazing. And how do you think Israel will kind of respond to the 200th anniversary of CMJ, knowing that the role of this ministry over 200 years ago played a major role, as you've outlined in this programme, to begin to sow the seeds for the Jewish people to come home and see the restoration of the modern state of Israel?
Well, I think most Israelis wouldn't know about it, wouldn't interest them. A lot of Israeli historians, though, will be aware of it and will take note and will acknowledge the key role that CMJ has played. Those who are in the government, I don't think they will actually want to know much about it at all. But nevertheless, it shouldn't put us off. We want to make sure that we do honour those who deserve to be honoured.
Absolutely. Kelvin, I just want to thank you so much for being my special guest. It's always a pleasure to have you on this programme. Your historical knowledge and understanding is absolutely exceptional. So it's an absolute pleasure for me, and I'm sure our viewers watching, to actually hear you and tell the remarkable story of how CMJ began. So thank you so much for being my guest today.
One thing I want to say at the end, I'm just a bush boy saved by grace.
And God's used you powerfully. And I just want to thank you for watching this programme today. We've just outlined the incredible 200-year history of CMJ's involvement with Israel. And it's incredible. So we can see that God is in charge of history, because history is his story. And if he wants to carry out his purposes, he does that. So please get involved and support the work of CMJ. So thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.